Restoration Theology, number 12, Analytic Theology and Logical Evaluation. So far, we've looked at biblical theology and see how an idea develops throughout Scripture. We've looked at systematic theology to understand clear statements of belief based on a final form. And now, today, we are looking at analytic theology, which is all about logical evaluation. So if you love logic, you're going to love this one. And if not, then, you probably still need to know it. So, analytic theology. What is logic? Let's start with that question. What is logic? Here's a definition for you. Logic is careful reasoning that avoids fallacies and draws valid conclusions in pursuit of truth. Okay, what's a fallacy? A fallacy is an error in logic in which the conclusion does not follow from the premises. So, putting it all together, what we get is really two different kinds of logic. If I could just be kind of simplistic about it, you have informal logic, basically just everyday reasoning. Oh, I feel really bloated. What did I eat for lunch? Oh, I went to the buffet, I had a big lunch. Cause and effect, logical deduction, we understand that, right? That's basic informal logic. Or you may infer something. Somebody might say to you, I was there, and then because they weren't there, they were with you. You say, no, you weren't there, you were with me. We were doing this at that time. And so we can recognize a contradiction, and that's a logical move as well. So there's informal logic, and then there's formal logic. Formal logic converts sentences into symbols for rigorous analysis, and they employ syllogisms to demonstrate valid conclusions. What's a syllogism? A syllogism is a deductive argument in which there are two premises and one conclusion. What's a deductive argument? A deductive argument is a form of inference in which the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises. If the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. Let's look at an example. Premise 1. All pastors need wisdom to lead their congregations. Premise 2. Sean Finnegan is a pastor. Conclusion. Therefore, Sean Finnegan needs wisdom to lead his congregation. You see how this works? We have two premises and a conclusion. If premise 1 is true and premise 2 is true, then the conclusion must necessarily follow if it's a valid syllogism. So, for example, if Sean Finnegan is not a pastor, then the conclusion is invalid, right? Or the conclusion may still be valid, but it's not true because the premise is false. Or if all pastors don't actually need wisdom, then the conclusion would be false again. So if we get a true, then the conclusion should be true as well. All right, so what people have decided to do is to learn how to represent these sentences with symbols. So I'm going to show you some symbols, and if you're a math person, you're probably going to love this. Everyone else, just strap in. It's not going to be so bad, all right? But let P of X equal X is a pastor, and let W of X equal X needs wisdom to lead his congregation. Then we use the notation, and it's kind of like an upside down A here. I don't know if you see that. For every X such that X has the property P, then X has a property W. That's the rigorous, using variables manner of describing it. So that's premise 1. Premise 2, Sean has the property of being a pastor. Conclusion, Sean Finnegan has the property of needing wisdom to lead his congregation. So this is the same exact truth that we laid out here in the simple syllogism. It's just we've converted it into symbols and used more formalized terminology. All right, let's look at another example. Another simple syllogism. Premise 1, all pastors need energy. Premise 2, coffee provides energy. Conclusion, therefore all pastors need coffee. Is this logically valid? No, it is not logically valid. Why is it not logically valid? Because the argument is assuming that coffee is the only way to get energy. There are plenty of other ways to get energy than coffee. You could get energy from soda. You could get energy from just good old-fashioned Whole Foods. You could get energy from having a good night's sleep. You could get energy, if you're Gen Z, from some terrible energy drink that is probably going to kill you if you drink too many, right? Like, there's lots of ways to get energy. So it doesn't follow that all pastors need coffee. Some pastors, and I don't even really want to talk to these people, don't drink coffee, you know. But after I've had my coffee, then I do want to talk to them. So that's a blessing. Anyhow, this is actually a fallacy called the undistributed middle. And the middle term is what connects the two premises, but does not appear in the conclusion. So in this case, the middle term is energy. We see energy and energy, but in the conclusion, there is no energy. Energy functions as the middle term here, and the energy is distributed in the first premise because all pastors need energy. That is actually true. Premise 2, coffee provides energy. In that case, there are other sources of energy other than coffee, so that's where our flaw is in the argument. The corrected conclusion would be coffee is one way to provide energy to all pastors. It's not the only way. All right, so you kind of get a sense of this. There are many types of fallacies. Here is a list. Ad hominem, appeal to authority, appeal to emotion, appeal to popularity, red herring, straw man, genetic fallacy, tu quoque, begging the question, complex question, false dilemma, suppressed evidence, false cause, equivocation, amphibole, composition, division, hasty generalization, slippery slope, weak analogy, appeal to ignorance, affirming the consequent, denying the antecedent, undistributed middle, we just covered that one, and illicit major, illicit minor. All right, so I could spend the next hour explaining each one of these to you, and you'd all fall asleep, and there's probably like 1% of the people would be like, oh, tell me the next fallacy, so that you could succeed in a debate or something, right? But I'm not going to ask you to memorize these or even understand them all. For our purposes, I just want you to know fallacies exist. They are errors in logic. If you are putting together a logical argument where you have two premises and a conclusion, if there's a fallacy, it makes it invalid. Okay, so that's why they're important. This is a powerful tool for analysis. I'm going to show you how you can use it, even without memorizing all these fallacies. Okay, let's shift gears for a minute. Let's talk about analytic theology. Analytic theology began in 2009 with Oliver Crisp and Mike Ria's book, Analytic Theology. They edited it, and it contained essays subtitled New Essays in the Philosophy of Theology. So analytic theology has only been around since 2009. And here's the crazy thing. No matter who you ask what analytic theology is, they never tell you. All right? So like even in that book itself, someone named William Abraham said he defines analytic theology. He says, it's a systematic theology attuned to the deployment of the skills, resources, and virtues of analytic philosophy. Oh, thank you, William Abraham. That just cleared it right up. We could just go home now. No, it's not clearing it up. You're just punting it downfield to say, well, actually, this is just analytic philosophy applied to doctrine or applied to systematic theology. Same thing with Phil Weston in his book, Introducing Analytic Theology. He defines it as a branch of systematic theology which makes use of analytic philosophy, again, analytic philosophy, to offer an orderly thematic account of the Christian faith. So, in my opinion, these definitions are not helpful to 99+% of us that don't already know what we're talking about. So let's back up and let's talk about analytic philosophy so you know what's going on, okay? Let's do a little history of analytic philosophy, starting in the 1800s. 1879, Gottlob Frege produced the first formal system of logic for math. Now, before Frege, of course, Aristotle, hundreds of years before Christ, had developed syllogistic logic that I was showing you, like two premises and a conclusion. That's old. That's super old. That's Greek philosophy. Classic example, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Like that kind of reasoning already existed. But what Frege did is he started using symbols, and his focus was math, but he wanted to use symbols to formalize logic, so he could sort of use it in the same way that math uses other symbols, like algebra, for example. So then Bertrand Russell came along, and he took Frege's logic system and made it more accessible and applied logical analysis to natural language, not just math. And he also found a contradiction dealing with sets, and he solved it, which we're not going to get into. And so his big book came out in the year 1910, Principia Mathematica. Next, we had Ludwig Wittgenstein, and he focused on ordinary language, meaning, and clarity. Now, Wittgenstein is important, or Wittgenstein is how you say it for the Germans, but he's important because of, especially for a lot of things, but what I want to draw your attention to is this word clarity. This is a big deal to analytic philosophers. Analytic philosophers do not want to write in such a way that there is ambiguity. Ambiguity means like it could mean this or it could mean that. Like the word bat. It could be something you swing to hit a ball, or it could be a flying creature, right? There's an ambiguity in the word bat. So an analytic philosopher would say, bat the mammal, to specify what kind of bat he's talking or she's talking about, right? So clarity, that's very important. Then we had the Vienna Circle in the 1920s and 30s, and they kind of put a turd in the punch bowl because they were the scholars like Carnap, Neurath, and Schlick who developed logical empiricism, and they developed this verification principle, which basically said that only things that are empirically verifiable, logically necessary, or logically provable are worth talking about. So therefore, we're just going to focus on science. We're not going to talk about how you should live or anything related to religion or theology. We're just going to talk about science. And so that, in my opinion, was not all that helpful of a development. But then Karl Popper came along, and Karl Popper said in the 20th century, he argued that the verification principle was too strict because even in math and science, there are lots of non-verifiable facts. So this was something that was so strict that it ruled out its own existence. And so Popper put forward the principle of falsifiability. Falsifiability is the idea that an idea is only worth talking about if it could be proven false. Not that it actually is false, but that it has to be able to be proven false. So a classic example is like the dark side of the moon is made of cheese. Like, well, unless you have a spaceship that could go there, how are you ever going to disprove that, right? Or some distant planet that we don't have a way to get to is made of cheese, right? Like you can't disprove it. So it's not worth even talking about for Popper. Then we finally get the neo-analytic philosophers of the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s, Parfit, Nehemiah, Lewis, and Williams. They shifted away from just focusing on science, and they applied analytic philosophy to ethics, aesthetics, and metaphysics, which in my opinion is where it gets exciting. Which then leads us back to where we started with Oliver Crisp and Michael Rea, who said, hey, let's apply analytic philosophy to theology and see what happens. And that is how analytic theology was born. It was an outgrowth of analytic philosophy. Once again, analytic philosophy is just really the whole enterprise of careful reasoning, especially using symbols and logic to test things to see if they're true. Analytic theology seeks three things according to Phil Weston. 1, conceptual precision. 2, logical rigor. And 3, transparency of argument. All right, this first thing, Conceptual precision. Specify your idea with clarity and simplicity. Don't use metaphors or decorative language. Translate the idea into straightforward propositional statements. The analytic theologian has no time for flowery language or fancy analogies or stories about cats stuck in trees. The analytic theologian wants simple propositional statements that are easy to understand. Number 2 is logical rigor, which is where you write sentences that can be converted into those symbols that I showed you earlier. And so you want to have valid and sound arguments to show that an idea is truthful. So let me show you an invalid argument. I just made this up. All chickens are birds. Dogs are bigger than chickens. Therefore, it's better to have a dog than a chicken. It's a totally invalid argument. There's actually no connection at all between the first premise and the second premise. The fact that all chickens are birds has nothing to do with the dog being bigger than a chicken. There's just no real argument here at all. It's totally invalid. Like, just being bigger doesn't make you better. It depends on what you're doing. Like, if I'm eating a chicken sandwich, the fact that a dog is bigger doesn't help in any way. I don't want a dog sandwich. You know what I mean? That's gross. So, that's an invalid argument where premise 1 and premise 2 do not lead to the conclusion. The whole thing is just invalid. Now, it's interesting, though, because these premises are both true. Chickens are birds, and dogs are bigger than chickens. But the conclusion is false because it's invalid. It's committing a fallacy. Well, then you can have an unsound argument. This is where you have a valid argument, but one or more of the premises are false. So, premise 1, all Christians read the Bible every day. Premise 2, Frank is a Christian. Therefore, Frank reads the Bible every day. So, in this case, premise 1 and premise 2 do, in fact, lead to the conclusion. It is a valid argument. The problem is, both the premises aren't true. Okay? Let's assume that Frank is a Christian. Let's assume that's true. But let's be honest. Do all Christians read the Bible every day? It'd be great if we all did, but no, it's obviously not true. So, because premise 1 is false, however well-intentioned, it's still false, the conclusion does not follow because the premise is false, so it's unsound. All right, on to number 3 of analytic philosophy, which is the transparency of the argument. Analytic philosophers and analytic theologians want to show their work. You remember, in math class, you'd have a problem and you would figure out the answer and write it down, and then you lose points. They're like, you didn't show your work, right? So these guys want you to show your work. They don't want you to skip any steps. They want to see exactly how you reason, because it's all about transparency so that others can critique it and we can together grow in knowledge of what is true. So, how can you be transparent about your argument other than making your reasoning explicit? Spell out your assumptions. List out what your assumptions are. And list out what evidence you have for your position and what are the flaws in your position that you can see. The goal is to arrive at truth. All right, so that's a crash course in analytic theology. Let's see a method. How can you do analytic theology? I have, as always, a method. In this case, I have a 10-step method. I know what you're thinking. Sean, you're such an overachiever. It was only 4 for systematic theology, but I don't know. I was feeling frisky, I guess, and I wanted to do 10. So, state the doctrine simply is number 1. Number 2, identify your assumptions. Number 3, define terms and complex concepts. Number 4, restate the doctrine more clearly. So actually 1 and 4 are basically the same thing. It's just after you've done a little bit of identifying and defining, you're able to restate it a little more clearly. Number 5, list your reasons why this belief is true. This is what I'm always looking for when I hear an argument. When I hear somebody putting out some sort of belief, it doesn't even have to be Christianity related, just like anything. I'm always asking in the background, okay, what are your reasons? What's your evidence? Why do you think that's true? And if they just like wave their arms around and shout really loud and you know, their veins are popping out of their neck and their to me, that's not a reason. That's just passion, okay? So like, yeah, sure, be passionate, but like you still get 0 points until you give me an actual reason. Number 6, use logic to analyze your reasoning. Number 7, search out objections to your belief. Number 8, respond to objections. Number 9, invite criticism of your position. And number 10, revise your doctrine in light of the responses. So we've kind of talked about some of this already, this idea of searching out objections to your belief. That would include difficult verses, okay? And then responding to it. So we talked about that last time to some degree. But this is interesting too, inviting criticism and then revising. Those involved in analytic theology, because they're trying to show their work and make it transparent, they want others to come in and be like, oh, you didn't think of this, and it just proves your whole case. Like, that's actually good news for somebody that's committed to logic and reason, because that means that they're no longer believing something that is false. So they tend to be very open about getting feedback and making revisions. All right, so in light of the fact that, okay, we have this 10-step method, let's do an example together so you can see how it works. Let's talk about memorialism, okay? So let me state the doctrine simply, all right? I don't have a slide for this, so you're just going to have to listen. Here's my doctrine of memorialism. In communion, the bread and wine symbolize Christ's body and blood as a memorial of what he has accomplished for us. Okay? That's how I'm just defining it. That's my starting point. I'm just stating the doctrine simply. Memorialism is that in communion, the bread and the wine symbolize Christ's body and blood as a memorial of what he accomplished for us. All right. Let me identify my assumptions. Okay, so my assumption is that the Bible's true. Jesus actually lived. Jesus had a Last Supper, as recorded in the Bible, and, what he said at the Last Supper is authoritative for us as Christians. Those are all assumptions that I'm making without realizing it when I said my initial statement. All right, now I have to define terms and complex concepts. So, what terms would I define? Well, I need to define the word communion. Like, what in the world does that mean? Symbolize. What do I mean by symbolize? Memorial. What do I mean by memorial? That could mean different things. And then I need a fourth term, which is real presence. Okay? And that's not even in my argument, but it's so important because that's the other position. You have the memorialist position, which says Christ is remembered in a communion, versus the real presence position, which is Christ is actually present in the bread and in the wine. Okay, these are the two main views within Christianity today. And so I need to define these things. So what do I mean by communion? Well, I mean the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist, the ritual meal in which we eat the bread and drink the wine is a way of remembering Jesus' death. What do I mean by symbolize? Well, what I mean by symbolize is that the bread and the wine stand in for Christ's body and blood. A memorial is just something you remember. So memorialism is the idea that we're remembering what Christ did in the Christian ceremony of communion. And real presence, once again, is the idea that Christ is, in some sense, actually present in the body and the blood, or bread and the wine. All right, so now I have to restate the doctrine more clearly. Here's how I would do it. I would say, when taking communion, participants eat bread and drink wine, which represent Christ's body and blood, respectively, but not actually Christ's body and blood, as a way of remembering what he has done for us. So I just kind of restated my initial belief, but I stated it in a more careful way, just spelling things out, using less terminology, less jargon. And then we finally get to, okay, what are your reasons, man? List out your reasons why. All right, so I'm going to give you some reasons. Are you ready? Reason number 1 is biblical. At the Last Supper, Christ was there with his disciples. And he had bread, and he broke it. And he said, He's holding the bread. He said, this is my body. So to me, that's a clear indication of symbology. If I say to you, this is my life, while I'm holding up my phone, you know what I'm doing, right? This is not actually my life. Like, if my phone died, I would still be alive. Thank God, right? Some people, their phone is their life, literally. That's not good. But if Jesus is holding the bread and he says, this is my body, we know what he means. He's saying, this stands in for my body. This symbolizes my body. And he breaks it. He says, my body is going to be broken. We get what's going on. So that's my first point. I want to add to it a second point about personal experience. Have you ever taken communion? Have you ever had the bread and had the wine? To you, does it taste like a human body or human blood? No. Personal experience tells us that it's not actually a human body, which would be really gross, right? Or human blood. So we have personal experience. We can add to that a scientific reason. A scientific reason would be like, well, you could do like a test on the molecules to see, are they actually bread molecules or have they been changed, right? So you can give a scientific reason. And, there's no scientific test that can detect Christ's body. So if the Bible doesn't commit us to this view, and the phenomenon cannot be detected by me, the person eating or drinking, or scientifically, then we have no way to know that it's actually happening. And in the absence of reasons to believe is true, we should not believe is true. Therefore, we should not believe in the real presence, but instead believe that the bread and the wine symbolize the body and the blood of Christ as a way to remember what he's done. Okay? So that's my whole list of reasons. Okay? Now what you do is you use logic to analyze your reasoning, and this is how you find your hidden assumptions and logical fallacies, and you have the invalid and unsound conclusions and all this. That's what we want to expose. Now I realize that you probably don't have training in formal logic. Believe it or not, once upon a time, I studied to be an engineer. And one of the weirdest classes I took was actually a formal logic class. It was just terrible. And we just had all these symbols in this software, and we were just moving them around until we got the answer that the teacher wanted us to get. And I have totally forgotten how to do all that. So I'm with you guys. Like, even though I actually have taken a formal logic class, it does me no good because it was a long time ago. So what do we do? How can we do this? Well, you can sign up at your local college and take a class in logic, or you can buy a textbook, or AI. AI? Who better to do logic than a computer? They're literally the most logical things ever created, right? So it's just like in the wiring, so to speak. So we could just punch into AI our argument and have AI translate it into logical symbols and then tell us what are the problems with it. What a time to live in, huh? So that's what I did. I took the exact reasoning that I read to you in just a moment ago, and I punched it into AI, and I said, I want you to turn this into symbols for me and make a logical case. And I want to show you what AI spit out. It's really cool. All right, so AI said, first of all, we need some symbols. So they came out with these symbols, BESKRM. B stands for biblical evidence. E stands for personal experience. S is scientific evidence. K is knowledge of literal presence or real presence. R is real presence is true. And M is memorialism. That is the idea that the bread and the wine are symbolic. So these are the different symbols that we're going to use. And then AI generated this beautiful logical case. It doesn't all fit on one slide, so we have two slides for it. So, but I know this maybe for some of you, especially the non-math people, seems weird, but just trust me. This is going to make perfect sense. B, then not R. If B, then not R. Okay, so if there's biblical evidence that points to symbolism, then real presence is not established. If E, then not R. If the experience, personal experience, does not indicate literal presence, real presence is not established. If S, then not R. If science cannot detect literal presence, real presence is not established. And then this is the last three parts of the logical structure. We have B and E and S all together. If that's true, then not K. So if all three reasons hold, there's no biblical evidence for the real presence, we don't have any personal experience of real presence, and there's no scientific evidence for real, if that's all true, then we do not have knowledge of real presence. And then the next line, if not K, then not R. So if we don't have knowledge of real presence, then real presence is false. And then if not R, then M. So if real presence is false, then bread and wine are symbolic. Okay, I got to catch up to myself in the notes here. This way of looking at it helps us see the flaws, helps us see the reasoning, helps us see where there are going to be problems in our belief. It helps us see precisely what is going on, which leads us to step 7. Step 7 is identify logical defeaters for the doctrine and offer explanations. So, here are some defeaters. We can, let me slow down here. Okay, number 7, search out objections to your belief, right? Let's look at the objections. I'm calling the objections defeaters because if they defeat your argument, then that's why they're called a defeater. It's not my terminology, but it's typical. So, B, if we can show that there are defeaters for the biblical reasoning, in other words, we can find a Bible verse that says Jesus is actually present, then that would defeat B. If B is defeated, our whole case falls. Okay? E, if we can find a way to defeat the personal experience, then our case fails. S, if we can defeat S, our case fails. Like, if there is actually some scientific test that can detect Christ in the bread, then yeah, that would defeat us. And then there's church father defeaters. So let me just speak about this a little bit. Okay, so if you wanted to make a case biblically to defeat the idea that Jesus is not actually, that Jesus is not present, and you wanted to show that he is present, then you could go to 1 Corinthians 10:16, which Paul says, the cup, is it not a sharing in the blood of Christ? You say, okay, well, there's a verse in 1 Corinthians 10 that seems to say the opposite, therefore, you need to deal with that verse, or else it defeats the B in this equation here. Or E, personal experience. How can you defeat personal experience? Somebody could just say to you, look, man, you just don't even have faith. If you had faith, then you would experience it. I experience it. I know it's true. I taste the body. I taste the blood. There's 1 billion people on the planet that believe that the body and the blood are literally present in communion. So you'd have to deal with that objection. What about science? Somebody could just say to you, look, I know there's no scientific test to prove that it's true, but it's spiritually true, not physically true. It's not in the molecules, it's in the Holy Spirit. Right? So what we're doing is we're just kind of like looking at like how somebody would defeat our case, and then we offer explanations to those defeaters. We diffuse the defeaters, if that makes sense. And then we have church fathers. Somebody could come along and say, well, Ignatius of Antioch and Cyril of Jerusalem and Augustine all seem to believe in the real presence. These early Christians believed in it, therefore it must be a legitimate belief. Okay, so how would you defeat that defeater? You would look at other church fathers who took a memorialist perspective, or you would argue against them actually having a real presence perspective. Then there's the logical defeater, number 1, which is not having knowledge of something does not imply that it does not exist. Just because you don't know something doesn't mean it's not true. So how do you handle that? And then the logical defeater number 2 is that if real presence is false, that doesn't mean memorialism is true, unless memorialism is the only other option. It could be both are false and something else is true. So the only way we were able to get at these flaws or vulnerabilities in our argument is because we use the logical system. What the logical system showed us is that if you can disprove B or E or S, this whole thing fails. And if this is false, if not K, then not R. If you can disprove that, the whole thing fails. If this is not true, that not R leads to M or implies M, then the whole thing fails. So by having the symbols and seeing the flow of the argument, we're able to say, okay, we have some vulnerabilities we need to deal with. And then you can do the work to offer reasons why the defeaters are not effective at defeating, they're not actually defeaters. All right, now if you want to know about this, then you invite criticisms and revise the doctrine in light of responses. I don't have a way to do that with you here right now. But that's important. Send your case to someone from a different camp, ask for feedback, find someone to debate. This is the value of debates, and then revise it. So if you want a nice example of this, you can see analytic theologian Stephen Nemish's book, Eating Christ's Flesh, A Case for Memorialism. He's an analytic theologian that literally does this. Not exactly my 10-step method, but he does this. And he works through all the verses and all the logic and the church fathers to show that memorialism actually makes sense. Now, I mentioned a moment ago about church history. And that was my master's degree, so I love church history. Always found it so fascinating to study people who have come before us. Now, church history is something that actually shows up a lot when you talk about doctrine. You would think it would just be Bible, 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 and logic, 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 and maybe personal experience. But church history actually does come up a lot. And so for that reason, we're gonna spend our next session looking at historical theology and doctrinal precedents as we continue through our class on restoration theology.